Okay, good morning. I think we have no bill this week, so I don't have any announcements. But I'm speaking. So my name is Brittany Vine. I'm the Community Engagement Manager here in Calgary. I guess there isn't anyone in Edmonton, so I'm assuming Calgary folks know who I am. I am going to speak this morning on stormy seasons and share a little bit about some reflections from my past year. And yeah, we'll see where it takes us. So I've been thinking about stormy seasons, and I'm imagining that you know stormy seasons too. There are those dry seasons where you're thirsty for resolution. The seasons when you no longer know how to put that thirst aside, and you used to be able to hide it, but then it just kind of spills all out over everything into this big, why God question. And you try to bring that thirst for answers to God, but you are so thirsty that the words just don't come out of your mouth. And the thickness of your silence is a raw, dry mixture of grief and anger and loneliness, but also a desire to trust. And that desire to trust is real, but it's partnered with a feeling of hopelessness that makes you even doubt if you really do want to trust at all. And maybe you have a few choice words for these stormy seasons. Maybe you're in a storm, or you know the storms well. I'll be honest, I don't have answers for you. What I have is a cutesy acronym and a story from my stormy season that I'll share with you, and I'll hope that you'll find something in it wherever you are. So my storm started in January 2017. In that month, I started getting sick, and I was getting sick a lot. And I went to the doctor, and it was the flu, and then maybe it was mono, and then maybe it was the flu and another flu or another virus, or we don't really know, just go home and rest, Brittany. And I went home and rested, and I wasn't really feeling better, but I wasn't really feeling worse, so I went back to just doing the normal things. But I was doing really good at self-care. I was taking naps and eating kale salads and going to the gym, and, as soon as things quieted down a bit, I would take a few days off, and after a couple days of rest, I would just feel better. And things quieted down a bit, and I took a couple days off, and I didn't actually feel any better. I actually felt a lot worse. And so I went back to the doctor, and I was doing all the things that she told me to, and I was still not feeling better. And finally, I went, and the doctor said, I don't know what to do. That's not actually the words that you ever want to hear come out of a doctor's mouth. They're supposed to be the experts. They're the advice givers. They're not the honest ones. They're not the ones that are supposed to say, I have no idea what to do, so maybe you could come back in a couple days after I've had some time to think. So she had her time to think, and I went home and I had it out with God. I don't know about you, but I really have it out sometimes in my stormy seasons. And I had it out with God because He'd just told me I was going into this big season of trust. I was going into this season where He told me, Brittany, you're going to start to dream again, and I'm going to start to do things that are immeasurably more than you can ask or imagine. And I held that promise, but God, this isn't how you were supposed to do my promise. Isn't there another way to get to that promise? Maybe you've asked the same question. When I asked it, God said, no, there's no other way. But then He said this. He said, Brittany, I am going to show the doctors what I want to show them when I want to show it to them. And He said, this is going to be a season of joy. Didn't really feel like joy. It felt a little bit more like a season of devastation. But I went back to the doctor, and she looked at me and she said, Brittany, I'm diagnosing you with this thing called chronic fatigue syndrome. And she didn't have to say more because I already knew what that meant. I knew it was a 5% chance of ever being diagnosed recovered. The 5% chance of recovery and a 15% chance of ever going back to full-time work. Statistically, the odds were not in my favor. And I was thinking about all of those things, about how this is a mystery disease, that they don't really know what causes it, so they can't really know what to cure it with. And she said, Brittany, as of today, you're not going back to work until I say that you can. And then she said this. She said, I have nothing to give you, but I will prescribe you joy. She said, I'm going to ask you to go and do things, and only the things that will bring you joy. It's a little funny to hear your doctor quote God's promise back at you. But I went home with that. And I promise there's actually a really fascinating scientific explanation for this chronic fatigue syndrome that a really amazing team of medical doctors helped me figure out. It's a little bit of a tangent, so I can explain it to you another day if you would like. But I went home with that prescription of joy, and I rested. I did weekly IV treatments. I took 20, 30 pills a day and slept a lot and still ate lots of kale salads and found joy. And in this process, physically around me, the world, the way that those stats stacked up against me and the kind of physical diagnosis that I had from the doctor, it should have suggested that this would have been a really horrible season, that it should have been a giant storm around me. But in this season, God gave me a really beautiful gift. And he gave me this gift of being able to have peace and joy and just be at rest in this season. Spiritually, I was calm, even though there was a physical storm around me. And if you don't know me well, I will assure you that this is not because I worked for it or I'm just really good at these things, because I'm naturally inclined to be a striver and a go-getter and a doer, and not the person that just sits back and just lets things happen. Chill is not usually a word that's used to describe me. So it was a gift, and it was God. And it wasn't something that I was capable of creating for myself. This past January, a year later, I saw a series of specialists. And each of those specialists said, you are healed of chronic fatigue syndrome. And what was interesting is then they said, what's so fascinating to us is that you are healthier than you were before this chronic fatigue thing even started. And maybe they call that fascinating because they're medical professionals, but to me, I look at that and I say that's God fulfilling his promise of doing immeasurably more than I could ask or imagine. And when I think about that, I think if you're sitting in the middle of a storm, maybe I've lost you just momentarily for this kind of brief second where you found yourself in this gap between this thing that you're waiting for and someone sharing about a promise from the other side. Because it's really easy to wrap up our resolutions in a neat little bow and present it like it's really simple. And it's not really simple at all. I know that it's not. I have faced other storms, and it's not so simple when we're in the storms. I think sometimes we need stories of the promise, stories from the other side, and sometimes those moments when we're in the storms and we're in that waiting, it feels a little bit like a special kind of grief or death. And in those moments, I think what we really need is some spiritual CPR. So CPR, spiritual CPR, is what I have been learning, not mastering, this past year. It's something that is a process of engaging that I've been reflecting on, and I wanted to share with you this morning. So spiritual CPR is courage, perspective, and rest. Courage, C, P for perspective, R for rest. Spiritual CPR. I'm going to start with courage. Actually, yesterday as I was preparing my notes, I just happened to come across an article written by Ann Voskamp. Ann Voskamp wrote about the seasons when you're caught between God and a hard place. Anyone ever felt like they're caught between God and a hard place? She writes about those everyday places that feel like the God-forsaken places. That's what I call stormy seasons. And she suggested the weariness of these spaces make us feel like we no longer want to be courageous, like we don't have anything left in us to feel brave anymore. And in reading that, I thought, yeah, that's what a stormy season is. It's when we don't have an ounce of courage left and we just don't have the ability to feel brave. And then Voskamp writes this. She says, do you dare believe that the place that you're in is a place where God's moved in? You never have to be brave alone, because the truth is, find a place that you don't need to be brave, and you found a place that you don't need God. Find a place that you don't need to be brave, and you found a place that you don't need God. So maybe sometimes all the courage that we have is to invite God in, and then we find out that he's actually already moved in. Maybe in that space we find the boldness to give God our honest prayers. You know them, those kind of prayers that you would never say out loud in a church service, but they're important prayers. Maybe it's courageous to invite God into all of it with us, to tell him that we're angry or we're sad or we're doubting, and yet there is that part of us that longs to feel hope. So maybe courage is just the act of inviting God in and finding out that we're not alone. And that courageous invitation allows us to enter into the second part of spiritual CPR, which is perspective. If you're like me, maybe when we're talking about storms and perspective, you've already jumped ahead to which passage you think I'm going to hop to. Peter and Jesus is walking on water, and Peter steps out to go see him. And we hear this story a lot. Peter then sees the wind and the waves and takes his eyes off Jesus, and he starts to sink. And the moral of the story that we get is keep your eyes on Jesus. But maybe sometimes we're a little bit more like Peter than we want to admit. And as much as the concept of keeping our eyes on Jesus is really great, it's just that to us. It's a concept, it's a great idea, but how do I fix my eyes on Jesus when I'm in the middle of this storm, God, and don't you know what's going on? Maybe we can grasp that concept intellectually, but maybe also sometimes what we need to find in that story is an invitation. When the fixing our eyes on Jesus just feels like striving, maybe there's something else. So I've been reading a lot in the book of Luke recently. And Luke doesn't actually write about this passage of Jesus walking on water. But he writes about two other storms. He writes about a physical storm and a spiritual storm. This is a concept that the musician Sean Foyt talked about recently as well. So physical storms and spiritual storms. In Luke 8, we find the physical storm. The disciples are again on a boat, and a storm comes up upon them, and Jesus is fast asleep. The physical storm, wind and waves and anxious disciples, and Jesus sleeping. The disciples wake Jesus up. He calms the storm. He says, do you not trust me? We know the story. It's a physical storm. Jesus asleep, disciples awake. But there's an interesting inverse to this later in Luke. In Luke 22, we find a spiritual storm. In this spiritual storm, Jesus is praying in the garden in the hours before his crucifixion. He's battling with these spiritual things that are before him, and the disciples are fast asleep. So in the spiritual storm, Jesus is awake, but the disciples are asleep. So here's how I see it. Too often we're like the disciples. We're awake to things that Jesus is asleep to, and we are asleep to the things that he is awake to. It's not always about our failure to keep our eyes on him in the storm. Sometimes it's about the fact that we haven't asked him to give us perspective. And if he gives us perspective, maybe he'll draw our attention to the things that he's awake to. And he'll give us the gift of turning away from the things that he's asleep to. If we could only be awake to the things that he's awake to and asleep to the things that he's asleep to, maybe fixing our eyes on Jesus looks a little bit like that. I don't think that we can give ourselves this gift of perspective. I truly believe that God gives us this perspective when we courageously invite him in, when we ask him for it. This perspective isn't the same as an answer, though. We don't always get to hear that answer to the why. We don't even always get the perspective of how exactly things have been answered. It's not always that things get tied up in a neat little bow. But I do think that perspective allows for movement. Peter, as he looked at Jesus, was able to step forward, and it was when he lost that perspective that he sank in the waves. And so I think as God gives us a perspective that he wants to grant us, or a perspective, it's not always an all-encompassing perspective. As we get perspective from God, it allows us to move forward past those questions of why and into the things that he's awake to. That space is created when we courageously invite God into the storm with us, and he gives us perspective. That's what I call rest. If nothing else, true rest, I think, really is just togetherness with God. Courage allows for perspective, and perspective allows for rest, and together those create this space where we can sit with God in the middle of our storm and not be overcome by it. The storms are the things that we can't calm ourselves, but that space of rest is a space where we find calm with God. So here's the thing with CPR, the real CPR this time, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. When you look it up, it says CPR may succeed in inducing a heart rhythm that may be shockable. In other words, CPR may allow for defibrillation, and that's going to return circulation, which returns life. When I look at that, I think about the way that CPR is in action, but we still need that external source. And maybe our process of spiritual CPR is re-inviting God to be an injection of life, to be our external source in our storm. Inviting him to inject life back into a moment or a space or a year or a season that just feels like too much. We find peace and joy and fullness when we do this, but we are not consumed by it. Courage, perspective, and rest. May we invite God in. May we ask him for perspective and find rest in him, but not be so focused on the outcome. That's a perspective piece again. When we know that God honors his promises, he doesn't always honor his promises in a way that aligns with our human understanding. I still believe he gives us perspective, but just not always in the way that we think we're going to get it. There's hope in that for me in our storms, but I have one kind of final thought of hope. I conducted a very scientific Wikipedia research study about cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and I came across something called the Lazarus phenomenon. In layman's terms, it's a phenomenon that's observed when cardiopulmonary resuscitation has failed and someone is declared dead. And then spontaneously they come back to life. It's an interesting name when we look back to biblical Lazarus story. It's also something that I think brings a final bit of hope in these stormy seasons. Because as much as we can talk about how we should posture ourselves and how we can engage in this process of spiritual CPR, sometimes we fail. And we serve a God who can still show up. When the CPR has failed and it seems like all hope is lost and we think that there is death, there can still be those spontaneous moments of hope that resurface. Those spontaneous injections of life that God brings that's not at all dependent on how we've postured ourselves and how good we are at the rhythms of CPR. And for me, that's the big hope of knowing God. We get the opportunity to invite him in, but he's going to show up whether or not we have. So God, I thank you that you are a God that brings life. I thank you that you bring perspective and rest to our stormy seasons. Lord, give us the courage to invite you into these dry and stormy spaces and give us the hope when all seems lost. Thank you.